The village of Kabanyas in the Kiev province, 1893. The air is thick with the smell of leather, manure, and sour cabbage. Here, in one of the poor Jewish families within the confines of the suffocating Pale of Settlement, a boy was born, Lazar Moiseyevich Kaganovich. His world was small and harsh. The future seemed predetermined for generations to come. Hard labor, meager earnings, humiliating powerlessness. The primary education he received was only a drop in the ocean of knowledge. The ability to read, write, and count, nothing more. It was enough to avoid being cheated at the market, but not enough to break out of the vicious circle. From the age of 14, his hands had already felt the rough texture of the working world. First, there was the shoemaker's workshop, where the acrid smell of glue and sweat ate into his clothes and skin. Then there were the factories and plants, humming, breathing steam and coal dust. Every day was like the one before, monotonous work, meager pay. But it was in this environment, among others like him, young and embittered, that he heard other words. Words about justice, about struggle, about a new world where people like him would own everything. Underground circles, secret meetings in dimly lit rooms, banned pamphlets passed from hand to hand. All this became a real university for him. He absorbed the ideas of Bolshevism with the eagerness of a man dying of thirst. Here, his natural energy, toughness, and organizational talent found their application. He was not a theorist floating in the clouds of philosophical debates. He was a practitioner, a man of action. Organizing strikes, distributing leaflets, convincing the doubters, this was his element. The Revolution and the Civil War became the crucible that finally forged Kaganovich's character. He rushed from front to front, brought order to the rear, and carried out any assignment from the party with fanatical devotion. He was not afraid of blood and knew no doubts. By the early 1920s, he was already a prominent figure in the party apparatus, but his real rise was yet to come. The turning point came in 1924, after Lenin's death. The party leadership split. Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, recognized leaders, brilliant orators, and theorists, began a fierce struggle for the legacy. Against their backdrop, Joseph Stalin, who held the modest but key post of General Secretary of the Central Committee, seemed to many to be a secondary figure, but not to Kaganovich. He was one of the first to recognize in Stalin the same iron will and practical acumen that he himself possessed. While others were making impassioned speeches and writing articles, Stalin quietly placed his people in key positions, creating his own support base within the party. Kaganovich took a gamble, and it paid off. His unconditional support was appreciated. He became one of the most reliable tools in Stalin's hands. Wherever he was sent, to Ukraine to carry out collectivization, to Moscow to lead the capital's party organization, he acted with the same straightforwardness and cruelty. He did not ask questions, he carried out orders. His loyalty was absolute, and it was generously rewarded. By the early 1930s, Lazar Kaganovich had entered the highest echelons of power, becoming a member of the Politburo. The boy from a poor village had become one of the rulers of a huge country. Even in those years, his leadership style was extremely clear. When he arrived to inspect a factory, he did not listen to long reports from the director in a cozy office. He went straight to the workshop, pointed his finger at a dirty machine or uncleaned rubbish, and immediately on the spot, in front of all the workers, gave the management a dressing down. For him, there were no authorities except one, the one who sat in the Kremlin. Everyone else was just an executor, a cog in the huge machine that he was helping to build. And woe betide the cog that failed. His energy seemed inexhaustible, volcanic. It demanded an outlet, and Stalin provided him with an arena worthy of its scale, Moscow. In 1930, Kaganovich became first secretary of the Moscow Party Committee, effectively the absolute ruler of the capital. And he got to work. In his eyes, Moscow was not just a city, but a symbol, a showcase of the new world. Old, merchant-like, with crooked alleys and golden church domes, it had to die so that an ideal socialist metropolis could be born in its place. A grandiose and ruthless reconstruction began. The project was simple and terrifying in its straightforwardness: to cut through the living body of the city with highways as wide as the avenues of the future, and to demolish everything that stood in the way. For Kaganovich, the historic buildings that had defined the appearance of Moscow for centuries were nothing more than annoying obstacles, remnants of a cursed past. With his approval, the Kitai-Gorod Lal, the red and white gates, and Sukharev Tower, a masterpiece of Peter the Great's Baroque style, which the country's best architects and artists begged to be preserved, were blown up. Their letters and petitions sank into the indifferent silence of the offices. Kaganovich was deaf to sentimentality. He was building the future, and the future, as he believed, had no time for nostalgia. The apotheosis of this creative vandalism was the destruction of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. The grandiose cathedral, built with public donations in memory of the victory over Napoleon, was an ideological thorn in the side of the new authorities. It was decided to erect something even more grandiose in its place: the Palace of Soviets, a gigantic pedestal building crowned with a 100-meter statue of Lenin. Kaganovich personally supervised the project. On 5 December 1931, two powerful explosions shook Moscow. The temple, which could not be destroyed on the first attempt, collapsed, raising a huge cloud of dust and grief into the winter sky. In its place remained a gaping wound, which was later filled with water, turning into the Moscow swimming pool. The Palace of Soviets was never built. But Kaganovich's main brainchild, his true monument, was the Moscow Metro. The idea of an underground railway in Moscow was not new, but it was he, with his bulldozer-like drive, who was able to turn it into reality. It was not just a transport task, but an ideological project of paramount importance. The metro was to become an underground palace for the proletariat, a vivid demonstration of the advantages of the Soviet system. Kaganovich threw himself into this work with gusto. He was not an engineer, but he had a phenomenal ability to delve into details, demand the impossible, and get his way. He personally descended into the mines, sinking into the mud and icy water of the floodings. He held meetings directly underground, in the light of dim lamps, shouting and gesticulating, infecting both engineers and ordinary metro construction workers with his frenzied energy. He did not tolerate excuses. There are difficulties, but there are no insurmountable difficulties for the Bolsheviks, his voice thundered. And the people performed a miracle. In the most difficult conditions, almost by hand, with the help of pickaxes, shovels, and wheelbarrows, they laid tunnels and built stations that were striking in their luxury. Marble, granite, mosaics, bronze lamps, all the best the country had to offer went underground. Kaganovich personally approved the designs for each station, selected the types of marble, and monitored the quality of the finish. He understood that this was being built for centuries to come. The opening of the first phase on 15 May 1935 was his triumph. Trains, gleaming with varnish, glided silently through the tunnels, and yesterday's peasants and workers entering the underground halls stood still in amazement. These were truly palaces. Kaganovich's name was on everyone's lips. The metro officially bore his name. He was at the height of his glory, a creator, a builder, a man who turned dreams into reality. But there was another, darker side to this medal. While marble palaces were being built in Moscow, a wave of unprecedented famine swept across the vast country. And Lazar Kaganovich also had a direct connection to this. Even before his triumph in Moscow, he had been sent by the party to one of the most terrible fronts: collectivization. As Stalin's emissary, he traveled around the North Caucasus and Ukraine, extracting grain from the peasants. His methods were simple and effective. He did not delve into economic subtleties. For him, there was only the grain procurement plan, which had to be fulfilled at any cost. Peasants who did not want to give up their last and join the collective farms were, in his eyes, not people, but class enemies, saboteurs, kulaks who had to be destroyed. He introduced black boards, a system whereby entire villages that failed to meet the plan were subjected to a total blockade. Everything was taken from them, down to the last grain, condemning them to starvation. Departure from the village was blocked by NKVD detachments. It was genocide, organized with cold bureaucratic precision. Evidence of his speeches to local party workers has survived. He did not appeal. He demanded, threatened, and branded them for rotten liberalism and sympathy for the kulaks. His energy, which moved tons of earth in Moscow, sucked the last juices of life out of the villages here. He was one of the main architects of the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, which, according to various estimates, claimed between 4 and 7 million lives.
Millions of people died in terrible agony while he was in Moscow accepting parades and laying the foundations for new metro stations. Did he see a contradiction in this? Apparently not. In his worldview, everything was logical. In order to build a bright future for some, the proletariat, it was necessary to ruthlessly destroy others, individual farmers. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, and there were millions of eggs in that omelet. By the mid-1930s, Kaganovich had taken charge of another key industry, transport, becoming the people's commissar for transport. The country's railways were in a deplorable state. Accidents, schedule disruptions, chaos. Kaganovich took on the task with his usual determination. He introduced military discipline to transport and established political departments to monitor the reliability of railway workers. The slightest offense could result in not only the loss of one's job, but also one's freedom. But the real horror began in 1937. The wave of the Great Terror that swept the country took on a special scale in the transport sector. Kaganovich enthusiastically set about cleansing his industry of saboteurs, spies, and diversionists. Any accident or crash was now automatically interpreted as the result of malicious intent on the part of enemies of the people. Lists of people to be arrested flowed continuously from his People's Commissariat to the NKVD. He personally signed execution lists, sending thousands of people to their deaths, from ordinary signalmen to railway chiefs. His signature, bold and confident, stood alongside those of Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov on documents that were death sentences. He was one of the driving forces behind this bloody machine. His speeches during that period were full of fierce calls for vigilance and the merciless eradication of enemies. He was not simply following orders. He was a staunch supporter of terror as a method of governing and building a new society. He sincerely believed that enemies were swarming around him and had to be destroyed so that they would not interfere with the great construction project. And he destroyed them, thousands of them, tens of thousands. After Stalin's death in 1953, Kaganovich's world began to collapse. Accustomed to being at the very center of power, he suddenly found himself on the periphery. The new era that began with Khrushchev's report on the cult of personality at the 20th Congress was alien and hostile to him. He could not and would not accept the denunciation of Stalin, whom he considered a genius. For him, it was a betrayal of everything he had dedicated his life to. In 1957, he made a last desperate attempt to bring back the old days. Together with other old Stalinists, Molotov and Malenkov, he tried to oust Khrushchev. This episode went down in history as the anti-party group case. But times had changed. Khrushchev was supported by the army, represented by Marshal Zhukov, and most members of the Central Committee. The conspiracy failed. For Kaganovich, it was the end. He did not meet the same fate as those he had sent to their deaths with a bullet to the back of the head, but rather suffered humiliating political disgrace. He was removed from the Politburo and the Central Committee, stripped of all his posts, and sent into exile as director of a small asbestos plant in the city of Asbest in the Urals. For a man who had controlled huge industries and the fate of the capital, this was tantamount to non-existence. He tried to work there in his usual style, shouting, demanding, giving reprimands. But no one feared him anymore. He was a living ghost of a bygone era. Soon he was sent into retirement. He returned to Moscow and settled in an ordinary flat on Frunzenskaya embankment. The man whose name was borne by the metro, cities, and factories became a personal pensioner of Union significance. His life turned into a long, monotonous epilogue. He outlived almost all of his comrades and enemies. He saw the Berlin Wall fall and the Warsaw Pact disintegrate. He lived to see August 1991. In his final years, he sometimes gave interviews in which there was not a hint of remorse. He remained a staunch Stalinist to the end, justifying collectivization, terror, and all the sacrifices as necessary for the construction of a great state. He spoke about the metro, factories, and industrialization. He either remained silent about the millions of lives lost or spoke of them as the inevitable costs of class struggle. He died on 25 July 1991 at the age of 97. Just a few weeks later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the country on whose altar he had sacrificed his own life and the lives of millions of others. There is a certain grim irony in this. Iron Lazarus, the last of Stalin's People's Commissars, passed away along with his era, leaving behind marble metro stations through which rushed the descendants of those he did not spare, and an unhealed wound in the historical memory of the people. His legacy is a constant reminder that great constructions and great crimes can be committed by the same hands. This hatred of the old world, a world of pogroms and humiliation, became one of the driving forces of his life. He did not simply want to build something new. He wanted to uproot and burn to the ground everything that reminded him of the past that had caused him and his people so much pain. This was not only a class-based impulse, but also a deeply personal, existential one. He was a product of his era, its most concentrated expression. A man without roots, without traditions, recognizing only one sacred thing, the will of the party, which for him merged with the will of one man. His devotion to Stalin was akin to religious fervor, and it passed the most terrible test possible, the test of his own family's blood.
Lazar had an older brother, Mikhail Kaganovich, who was also a prominent party figure and served as People's Commissar for the defense industry. In 1941, during the first, most catastrophic days of the war, Stalin unleashed his wrath on the leadership of the People's Commissariat for disruptions in supplies. At one of the meetings, he accused Mikhail of sabotage and links with the rightists. It was a death sentence. After the meeting, according to one version, Lazar himself called his brother and said, "The party and Comrade Stalin do not believe you." According to another version, he went to his brother's house. The outcome was the same. Mikhail Kaganovich, realizing that he would be arrested, tortured, and shot himself on the same day. Lazar Moisevich did not flinch. He did not try to defend his brother or beg the leader for leniency. He accepted his death as an inevitable sacrifice on the altar of party discipline. Loyalty to Stalin proved stronger than blood ties. This episode, like nothing else, reveals the icy essence of his character. He was a cog in the system, but a cog that willingly and convincingly tightened the screws on the necks of others, even if it was the neck of his own brother. He applied the same approach to the city. The 1935 master plan for the reconstruction of Moscow, adopted under his direct leadership, was a document of almost geological scale.
It did not envisage repair or improvement, but a complete overhaul of the urban fabric. The expansion of Tverskaya Street, then Gorky Street, became legendary. Kaganovich did not want to simply demolish houses. He was obsessed with the idea of technical omnipotence. On his orders, engineers developed a unique technology for moving multi-story stone buildings. Huge buildings, including the Masovet building, were cut off from their foundations, placed on giant rollers, and, to the amazement of Muscovites, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, moved deeper into the neighborhoods,
freeing up space for the expanding highway. The work was carried out at night, and it was said that the residents of the moved houses did not even wake up. It was a demonstration of power, an almost magical act, proving that nothing was impossible for the Bolsheviks. But behind this impressive showcase lay the demolition of hundreds of less significant but no less valuable buildings that formed the historical environment. During the construction of the metro, this contrast between the grand facade and the dark underbelly was even more striking. Official propaganda trumpeted the labor enthusiasm of the Komsomol volunteers, and it was certainly there. Young people from all over the country traveled to Moscow for the construction project of the century, lived in cramped barracks, worked in inhuman conditions, driven by their belief in a bright future that they were building with their own hands. But alongside them, in the same pits, other builders were also working. Prisoners from Dimitrovlag, one of the largest camps in the Gulag. Their labor was not publicized. Their names did not appear on the honor boards. They were a faceless and free labor force, expendable material for the great construction project. The exact number of people who died during the construction of the metro is still unknown. Their bones literally lie at the foundation of those very marble palaces that Kaganovich was so proud of. He knew about it, but it did not matter to him. Human life in his coordinate system was a negligible quantity compared to the greatness of the goal. When the party assigned him to grain procurement, he acted as commander of a punitive operation. He perfected the mechanism of the black boards to diabolical perfection. Villages listed on such a board were surrounded by troops. All trade was prohibited. Not only grain reserves were taken from the village, but all food products in general. Potatoes from cellars, pickles from barrels, flour from sacks.
It was a deliberate organization of famine. Kaganovich personally instructed local activists on how to conduct searches and how to break the resistance of the kulak elements. There is not a hint of compassion in his speeches from that period, only cold fury and class hatred. "We must take bread from the kulaks at any cost," he thundered from the podium. And his henchmen took it. They took the last of it, condemning old people, women, and children to a painful death. And he, having completed his task, would leave for Moscow to receive a report on the completion of another kilometer of the metro tunnel. During the years of the Great Terror, his role was not limited to signing ready-made lists. He was the initiator and catalyst of repression in the regions. His telegrams from trips to the regions have been preserved. Arriving, for example, in Chelyabinsk or Ivanovo, he would berate the local party leadership and NKVD authorities for insufficient vigilance and dulling the class struggle. He demanded an increase in the number of arrests and the uncovering of new conspiracies. "Your work in exposing enemies of the people is unsatisfactory. I demand that you pick up the pace and root out every last spy and saboteur," was roughly how his directive sounded. After his visits, the wheel of repression in the region began to turn at 10 times the speed. He was not just an executor, he was one of the architects of terror, who personally tuned and lubricated its guillotine mechanism. Even in his personal life, which, according to the recollections of his adopted daughter Maya, was quite happy, he was a caring father and husband, the shadow of big politics was always present. His wife, Maria Privorodskaya, was also an old Bolshevik, a comrade in arms in the underground. She knew what her husband was doing and, by all accounts, shared his convictions. Their home was a fortress, fenced off from the world of suffering that he helped to create.
But even this fortress was not completely impregnable. Fear was always in the air. Every phone call from the Kremlin could be the last. Kaganovich survived this meat grinder thanks to his absolute mimicry, his ability to guess and anticipate Stalin's desires, and his complete lack of what is commonly called a conscience. Life in asbest was a shock to him. Accustomed to commanding millions, he now had to manage a dusty provincial factory. Workers and engineers looked at him with cautious curiosity, as if he were a prehistoric fossil. He tried to command in the old way. He made nighttime calls and demanded the impossible. But his shouts no longer had their former power. They were no longer backed by the almighty Stalin and the execution chambers of the Lubyanka. Once, as the story goes, he yelled at the chief engineer, who calmly turned around and walked away, throwing over his shoulder, "Lazar Moisevich, times have changed." For Kaganovich, this was worse than death. Upon returning to Moscow, he immersed himself in his past. He spent hours poring over documents, reading newspapers, and writing endless memoirs in which he attempted to justify himself and his era. He told journalist Felix Chuev, who recorded long conversations with him, "Our fault is that we went too far, but without that, we would not have built socialism and won the war." He acknowledged excesses, but never the criminality of the system itself. Famine? It was a struggle against the kulaks. Repression? It was a fight against spies sent by the West. He had an ideological justification for every crime. He lived in his own reality, in a world where millions of corpses were just statistics on the way to a great goal. He never left 1937, even when it was 1991 outside the window. There is something symbolic in the fact that this man, a Jew who had escaped from the Pale of Settlement, became one of the most brutal proponents of a policy that, among other things, led to the revival of state anti-Semitism in the last years of Stalin's life, to the doctor's plot and the fight against rootless cosmopolitans. He helped build a system that ultimately began to devour those for whom it would seem it had all been started. He was at once a product, a victim, and an executioner of this system. His legacy is not only kilometers of tunnels and rails, it is also a deep scar on the body of the people, an eternal question about the price of progress and the nature of evil. Not demonic evil with horns and hooves, but everyday, bureaucratic evil, perpetrated by ordinary people convinced of their own righteousness. People capable of building palaces and signing death warrants with equal zeal. Lazar Kaganovich was just such a person. And while trains run along the metro lines once named after him, his shadow, the shadow of Iron Lazar, continues to be invisibly present in these gleaming underground halls, reminding us of the terrible price that was paid for them. His career as a cleaner began long before the Great Terror. Back in the 1920s, during the period of internal party struggle, Stalin used Kaganovich as a battering ram to crush the opposition at the local level. He was sent to party organizations where the Trotskyists or right-wing deviants were strong, and arriving with a mandate from the Central Committee, he wreaked total havoc there. He did not engage in theoretical discussions. He took action. He removed people from their posts, expelled them from the party, and destroyed their careers. This was his school, where he honed his methods: iron pressure, absolute intolerance of dissent, and the ability to instill animal fear. Particularly indicative were his activities in Central Asia, in Turkestan, where, as head of the Central Asian Bureau of the Central Committee, he fought with equal ruthlessness against both Basmachi and local national cadres suspected of separatism. There was the party line, and there were enemies. There was no third option. This straightforwardness was both his strength and his curse.
When he was in charge of the metro construction, it yielded remarkable results. There is a legend about how he personally accepted the first escalator at the Okatni Riyadh station. The engineers reported with concern that the mechanism was not yet fully debugged. Kaganovich, ignoring them, stepped onto the moving belt and rode down, followed by the entire commission, who did not dare to disobey him. He trusted the result, not the drawings. His famous phrase, uttered to the designers who demanded that ordinary incandescent lamps be installed at the stations due to a shortage of mercury lamps, became the motto of the construction project. If we can find blue lamps for the Palace of Soviets, then we can certainly find them for the underground palace, became the motto of the construction project. He demanded the impossible, and the impossible became reality, because everyone knew that the price of disobeying Kaganovich's orders could be too high. But when this same bulldozer logic was applied to people, it turned into genocide. His trips to Siberia and Kuban for grain procurement were like military campaigns. He thought in terms of the grain front. Peasants who hid bread to avoid starvation were deserters and traitors to him. He introduced the practice of counterplans. When a district fulfilled the plan handed down from above, it was immediately given a new, higher one, and so on until everything was completely cleared out. He personally interrogated arrested saboteurs, demanding that they reveal where the grain was hidden. After his departure, empty villages and thousands of corpses remained. He did not see faces. He saw tons of grain that had to be taken from the class enemy and given to the state. As People's Commissar of Transport, he used the same methods.
He introduced a system of political departments on the railways. In essence, he created a parallel structure of power consisting of commissars who monitored every move of the railway workers, from the depot manager to the train driver. Any technical malfunction or train delay could be classified as sabotage. He lobbied for the adoption of draconian laws under which being late for work was punishable by imprisonment. It was under him that the old engineers, trained under the Tsar, were declared the main cause of all the problems in transport and subjected to mass repression. They were replaced by young, promoted engineers who were loyal but often incompetent, which led to new accidents, and those, in turn, to new arrests. It was a vicious circle of terror that he himself had created. His closeness to Stalin was unique. He was one of the few who belonged to the inner circle that gathered at the dacha in Kuntsevo for the famous nightly dinners. There, in a smoke-filled room, in an atmosphere of crude jokes, copious alcohol, and constant fear, the fate of the country was decided. Kaganovich was not just a guest. He was an indispensable executor. Stalin valued him for his lack of reflection and phenomenal work ethic. He could entrust him with any task, knowing that he would work himself to the bone but get it done. Kaganovich was a master of bureaucratic intrigue. He knew thoroughly all the mechanisms of the party machine, which he himself had helped to create. He controlled the department of the Central Committee's governing party bodies, through which all appointments to key positions in the country passed. In essence, he was Stalin's chief personnel officer, his attack dog, ready to pounce on anyone his master pointed him at. His struggle against old Moscow was not merely an administrative decision. It was an act of ideological warfare.
When the best representatives of the intelligentsia, architects, artists, academics such as Igor Grabar and Alexei Shusev wrote a letter in defense of the Sukharev Tower, begging to preserve this unique monument, Kaganovich, according to recollections, contemptuously retorted, "And my university is the street, and I will destroy your beauty." This phrase sums up his entire essence. He hated the old world, the world of educated, refined people, the world that rejected and humiliated him. And once he gained power, he took revenge on this world, destroying its symbols with the relish of a nouveau riche burning paintings in the fireplace. Renaming streets, demolishing churches, building avenues. All this was for him an act of affirming a new order, his order. For many years after his resignation, he lived in a strange vacuum. The state he had served continued to pay him a large pension and provided him with an apartment and a dacha, but at the same time made him invisible. His name was erased from textbooks and removed from the facades of metro stations. For new generations, he became just one of the members of the anti-party group, a sinister abbreviation from a history textbook. He wrote endless letters to Khrushchev, then to Brezhnev, demanding justice be restored, explaining that he had always been a loyal Leninist-Stalinist and had acted in the interests of the party. These letters, full of self-justifications and references to quotes from the classics of Marxism, remained unanswered. Accustomed to his word being law, he faced the most terrible punishment for a bureaucrat: ignorance. His phone remained silent. Former colleagues, meeting him on the street, crossed to the other side. This slow, painful civil execution lasted almost 35 years. He outlived everyone. He outlived Khrushchev, who had deposed him. He outlived Brezhnev, who had ignored him. He saw on television how Gorbachev announced perestroika, how the ideals for which he had shed a sea of blood, his own and that of others, were collapsing. Perhaps this was his main punishment, to live to see the complete collapse of the world he had built with such cruelty and to realize that all the sacrifices had been in vain. Although, judging by his last interviews, even this realization did not come. He passed away convinced of his righteousness, deaf to the cries of millions, but with faith in his own historical mission. A man who wanted to build paradise on earth, but succeeded only in organizing hell. He was sent to Ukraine in 1925 as General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, with the paradoxical task of leading the policy of Ukrainization. Not knowing the Ukrainian language, he set about the task with his characteristic zeal, promoting national cadres and supporting the development of Ukrainian culture and language in the administrative sphere. It was a tactical move by Moscow, and Kaganovich executed it flawlessly. But when the party line changed a few years later, he became the gravedigger of this policy with the same ruthlessness. He denounced the very national communists he had promoted the day before, branding them as bourgeois nationalists and Pilsudski's agents. This ability to instantly change course by 180 degrees without the slightest twinge of conscience was his key trait, ensuring his survival and rise to power. He did not serve an idea, he served the power that was proclaiming that idea at the moment. The Great Patriotic War became another moment of glory for him, where his organizational talent and ruthlessness were in demand as never before. As a member of the State Defense Committee, GKO, he was responsible for the most important life support system of a country at war: transport. It was Kaganovich who led the evacuation of industry to the east, unprecedented in world history. Under bombardment, in the chaos of retreat, his iron fist directed the flow of trains. Entire factories, machine tools, engineers, workers with their families, hundreds and thousands of trains went deep into the country to start producing tanks and aircraft in Siberia and the Urals. He was omnipresent. His saloon car appeared at the most critical junction stations, where he staged show trials, dismissed officials from their posts, and sometimes even brought slow-moving bosses before a tribunal. He introduced martial law on the railways, equating railway workers with soldiers. Every train that reached the Urals was a saved part of the country. Every train with troops and ammunition that arrived at the front on time meant thousands of Soviet soldiers' lives saved. In this context, his ruthlessness worked for victory. He was the very iron People's Commissar who ensured the movement along the steel arteries of war, and his merit in this is undeniable. In the narrow circle of the Politburo, he was known for his booming, thunderous voice and absolute intolerance for what he considered empty talk. He despised theorists and intellectuals, preferring practitioners, economists. His mind was not analytical, but instrumental. He did not ask himself why. He was only interested in the question how. How to fulfill the plan, how to build a road, how to produce bread. This trait made him the ideal Stalinist firefighter. He was thrown into the most disastrous areas, whether agriculture, transport, or heavy industry, and he, like a living battering ram, broke through the wall of problems, leaving behind a trail of broken lives, but achieved targets. After the war, when the country lay in ruins, he headed the Ministry of Building Materials industry, and under his leadership, hundreds of factories were restored and built, supplying bricks, cement, and glass for the giant post-war construction projects. He was a man of process, not of ideas.
And when the process stopped and the chief ideologist died, Kaganovich, like a complex and formidable mechanism left without an operator, proved useless and even dangerous to those who wanted to start the machine in a different mode. Kaganovich was not alone in his rise. He methodically pulled his brothers up with him, creating a kind of family clan within the nomenclature. Yuli became a prominent party functionary in Gorky. Israel headed the People's Commissariat, and Aaron was Deputy People's Commissar for the aviation industry. This family ties, however, did not save them from the juggernaut of the system, as Mikhail's fate showed. But the most tragic turning point in his biography was linked to his Jewish origins. Having escaped the humiliating Pale of Settlement, he became one of those who watched with icy silence and sometimes even contributed to the destruction of Jewish culture in the USSR. When the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee case began in the late 1940s, followed by the Doctors case, Kaganovich, a member of the Politburo, did nothing to defend his fellow Jews. Moreover, according to some accounts, he was among those who actively supported Stalin's idea of deporting Jews to the Far East. This paradox, a Jew who became an instrument of state anti-Semitism, reveals his personality more deeply than any reports. His phenomenal memory for numbers, his ability to recite the specifications of locomotives or the production capacities of factories from memory was only a tool. At one meeting, he was able to put any engineer to shame by pointing out an error in calculations from memory. The main thing, however, was his complete renunciation of his own roots, of any identity except one, that of a loyal soldier of the party. He burned out everything human in himself, leaving only a function, brought to absolute, terrifying perfection, ready to serve any directive, even the most cannibalistic.
Lazar Kaganovich left a dual legacy. On the one hand, infrastructure projects such as the metro and railway carriages, and on the other, participation in repressions that destroyed millions of lives. His life reminds us how greatness and tragedy are intertwined in history, prompting us to reflect on the price of progress.